Fiona, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. I'm afraid I'm going to be the typical economist naysayer in the crowd, but there's got to be one, right? So here I am. I am going to talk a bit about what I feel are some of the realities of land and housing markets and why we bump up against those when we're trying to design smart growth policies. Quickly, a brief outline of what I'm going to do. I'll just present a few facts about development land use patterns, talk about large lot development in the suburbs, just to ground some things in some of the facts that are out there. Then talk about some land use policy options and are they working? And obviously that could be a long talk in itself, and I'm just going to touch on a few things. In particular there, I'll speak a little bit about some work I've done on transferable development rights. And then I'll just talk about this issue with markets and some lessons learned. So yesterday Chester had a lot of maps, so I have to have my own map. This is the fabulous editorial cartoonist we have at the Washington Post, Tom Tolles. And this is from a few years back. U.S. population reaches 300 million, celebrated by the driving of the Golden Construction Stake, where the Great Western Exurb meets the Great Eastern Exurb. And I like the little guys in the corner, and now a fence. So, and I like the little the cities on the coast. We get the high rises, and then we have the large lot development. But of course, we're a long way from that. This is just to ground you in basic what the map really looks like. And of course, you know, let's face it, we have a lot of land in this country, and we have a lot of open land in this country, right? So we have a long way to go before there's any great western or eastern exurbs. I believe this is USGS, Geological Survey Land Cover data. I got this off the EPA website. But the various shades of red and pink are urbanized land or developed land uses. The green are forests, different types of forest. The yellow and the tan are mostly cultivated farmland and rangeland. So when you look at it like that, of course, it doesn't look too bad, right? Also, when you look at it like this, it doesn't look too bad. We only have about 6% of our land in developed uses. That's the,
very top one, I think.
Yeah, no, I can't. There
11
it is.
o'clock.
So there's the developed land uses of 6%. And obviously, quite a lot of land uses in undeveloped categories here. But it's not the same everywhere. So here's a look at a handful of states, and I sort of selected these at random. I put Connecticut on the list and included the states that are considered to be sort of smart growth states. And this is developed land as a percentage of non-federal land, so separating out the federal land, which takes up quite a bit of land in the West. And the U.S. average in 2007 is 7.5%. So it gives you a sense of where some states, you really do have quite a bit of land already in developed uses. Connecticut is up near 35%, so about 5 times the U.S. average. New Jersey up above 40% in 2007. And also this is showing you 2 points in time, so between 1982 and 2007, there's been a pretty significant increase in the amount of land that's in developed uses. This is a percentage increase in developed land acreage in those same states. And so there's Connecticut right around 100%. So you've had 100%, a doubling of land in developed uses in 25 years. All of these are pretty high numbers actually. Maryland, which is, the state where the smart growth term was actually put into law, is at 140%. And I'll talk a little bit more about Maryland because I've done quite a bit of research on Maryland. Here's the same sort of story. Again, of course, we've had an increase in developed land uses. We've had a population increase. So let's look at that. This is just, again, national data. The blue line, and this is just an index, so we put 1982 at 100. That's when our data starts here. And this is data from the USDA's National Resources Inventory. The blue line is the acres of land in developed uses. relative to our base period of 82, and the red line is population. So yes, population has risen, but the amount of land we're using to house people has increased much more. 57% increase in land area in the last 25 years for a 28% increase in population. So of course, the folks in this room who work on these issues know this fact. You know, we're taking up more land per person. Here's a few pictures. I don't have the beautiful photos we had yesterday, but I do have a few of my own sprawl photos. So this is Loudoun County, Virginia, about 25 miles from downtown DC. The edge of Loudoun County is about 25 miles from downtown. If you fly into Dulles Airport in Washington, you're basically in the beginning, right on the edge of Loudoun County. This is the bucolic farmland in the background and the suburbs in the foreground. Loudoun County had an 89% population growth rate from between 2000 and 2010. It's the fastest growing by far county in the state of Virginia. Quite a few issues with sprawl in that area and a lot of battles, but you know, Virginia's a fairly conservative state and they're not going to do too much. It's also a Dillon rule state, which means that the counties don't have a lot of things that the state has to allow them to do stuff, and there's not a lot that they can do. They cannot impose impact fees, for example. This is Los Angeles Exurbs. This is the town of La Crescenta, which is up in the mountains about 13 miles north of downtown LA. I've actually cropped this photo because that's a forest fire at the top. So if I put the whole photo on, you mostly see the fire. Some of my colleagues work on this, have some work on this issue about development at what the Forest Service refers to as the wildland-urban interface. And this is a significant problem in the West. Our fire suppression policies, something we haven't talked about today, we're Eastern oriented here, but our nation's fire suppression policies, which basically put out all forest fires, have led to development in fire-prone areas. And that, you know, exacerbates the cycle. Then we have to fight those fires because there's people there, for crying out loud, right? And homes and valuable properties. So this is a set of pretty high-value homes right up in a fire-prone area. And finally, this is Sacramento. This is Placer County, the fastest growing county in California, at least in the first half of the decade, 2000 to 2005. And this is sort of in the Sierra Nevada foothills and has just become a commuting area for Sacramento. So we all know what it looks like. Let's talk about the suburbs a little bit more because, you know, I'm a numbers person, so some of these numbers are, to me, are instructive. On the left is a pie chart showing you the number of lots developed in 2007, the percentage in different categories. And on the right is the same numbers, but in terms of acreage. And these categories are lot size categories. So the bottom three, the turquoise, the orange, and the blue, are the lot sizes greater than 1 acre. And this is American Housing Survey data from the Census Bureau, 2007. The 2009 is about the same. So these are the percentages of the lots built in that year that were 1 acre lots in the suburbs. So they divide things up, and this is suburban development. So that total is about, let's see, 57% of the lots were 1 acre or bigger. That's a pretty big number, I think, right? 1 acre lots, those are big lots. But look how much it turns out to be if you look at the acreage. Those same lots, the number of parcels is 57%, but the acreage of land is 96%. So my point here is that this large lot development of an acre or more really takes up a lot of land area. Okay, if you're going to put people even on quarter-acre lots, it's a much smaller impact on land. This is the same sort of information, but showing you over time. And this, again, is just new acreage in each year between 85 and 2009. And the blue line is the acreage that's in 1 acre lots or larger. And the lower ones are just the less than a quarter acre is the red, and green is between a quarter and 1 acre. Again, you know, there was a big increase in the 80s and 90s, but it started to level off a bit in the 2000s. And of course, Nothing like a recession to get people not to worry about sprawl, I suppose. So that's that drop-off there. So why do we have so much large lot development in greenfield locations? I'd like to offer, the economist view of this a little bit. And some of it will overlap with some of the things Owen said, but I'm not a historian, so I can't speak to that. First of all, for developers, a lot of times the developer will tell you it is a lot cheaper to go to a greenfield location than to do an infill development. And they're just, for many reasons, going to say that. Hey, consumers, the farther you get from the central business district, the cheaper the houses are. And this is a basic urban economics fact. There are a lot of other reasons, other factors affecting house prices, but the rent gradient is there and it's real. And people have limited incomes and can only afford to live in certain places. And so you've got to face those realities of consumers' preferences and budget constraints. But another key factor is local governments. Local governments are trying to finance public services with tax revenues. And in this country, we do that with property taxes at the local level. Okay, not many countries do this at all, right? So we finance our public schools with property taxes. And I say enter large lot zoning. What do local governments want to do? They want to raise as much property tax revenue as they can and serve as few people, with that, make that money go as far as possible. So they have kind of an incentive to go for large lot zoning. Let's make the lot sizes in this area, 5-acre minimums. That way we don't get too many kids in the schools, and we have very expensive large lot houses that are worth, we collect quite a bit of property tax revenue. So this is a fact, and large lot zoning is pretty prevalent in many suburban areas. But to continue, we also have some market failures. I wouldn't be a good environmental economist if I didn't talk about that, and some policy failures. Owen mentioned this, and I have to mention it as well. Our roads are unpriced, and this explains in part, at least, why consumers make the choices they do. So in evaluating where to live, obviously they consider transport costs and their time costs in getting to work and so forth, but they don't consider the impact they have on other drivers. And if we price our roads, we could take care of that. Again, speaking to some of the points that Owen was making, we don't treat transit the same way. So in Washington, D.C., if you ride the subway in Washington, D.C., you pay for your metro ticket. Not only that, if you ride during peak hours, rush hours, you pay a premium, right? In the middle of the day, you pay less. We don't do anything like that on roads. Now, admittedly, it's pretty hard, but I would argue needs to do more of this. We also have a problem in that new development often does not pay its share of infrastructure costs. This is also a well-known problem and taken care of to some extent in some locations with impact fees. But in general, existing residents will help to cover the costs of new development. And this is in terms of roads, sewers, schools, all kinds of things that local government is providing in the form of infrastructure. So that explains in part why developers want to go to a greenfield location, right? They're often not paying for those extra costs. Another market failure is there are benefits to open space, of course, right? There's benefits to parks, there's benefits to protected wilderness areas or habitat, and those values are typically, of course, not internalized by private property owners, right? If I own a piece of land and it's a beautiful farm and everybody loves driving by it, I have no way to sort of extract that rent from other people. And I just make my own decision about whether to develop that land. So we need to find policies that can kind of, take account of these external benefits. And then we have our fragmented local government decision making. There's a lot of benefits to the system, the federal system we have in this country, but there are also some problems in that one decision made in one jurisdiction spills over to others. And where we'd like to have coordination, we're not able to do that. And so we do it better in some places than others. So I'm just, there's many, many policy instruments and tools we might want to talk about here. I'm just going to throw a few up here. What can we do about this? What are some, because it's fine to talk about in general terms what we'd like the world to look like, but let's talk about what can we do? What are the instruments we have at our disposal to try to change land use patterns? Well, we have a variety of things that fall under the zoning category. We might try maximum lot sizes instead of minimum, or minimum density limits instead of maximum. We can offer density bonuses for special options like transit-oriented development, and these kinds of things happen in lots of places. We can have agricultural special use zoning to try to protect land. In subdivisions, we can require set-asides. You have to cluster the land on one particular, 25%, for example, is quite common. So you leave open space in the remainder. Transfer of development rights permits, which I'll talk a little bit more about. That's where we allow property owners to transfer their rights to somewhere else where it can be developed more densely. Purchase of development rights, communities do this to protect land from development. And a variety of infill development incentives to try to get more development in already built up areas with infrastructure. And there's a whole host of those things we can use. Impact fees, again, to make developers pay the cost of developing. And urban growth boundaries, so mandates. You're just not going to build in particular areas. So have they worked? Well, I'm going to say a couple things. First, it's very, very hard to know. It's hard to design experiments. We can't really experiment too much. We have to have quasi-experiments, look at what's happened, do statistical analysis, and see if we can tease out what's working. But it's very difficult to attribute the change that you see to the policy. And when you have multiple things in place, which all communities do, it's hard to disentangle what's really causing the change. And of course, what's the counterfactual? If you're going to compare land use patterns between 1985 and 2009, some of the data I put up, what would they have looked like otherwise? Obviously, you don't want to compare to 1982. Nonetheless, there's some studies out there. There are some people who worked very hard at this to look at how things have worked. And in some cases, we have to admit that even if we do see an effect, there's some ancillary impacts we need to take note of. Obviously, leapfrog development is one of them. One jurisdiction might do a good job of controlling growth, only to lead to growth in the next jurisdiction, and that's a serious problem. In housing and land price impacts, we have to recognize, for a variety of reasons, when we do these things, we're going to have an impact on values of land and housing prices. And this brings me to my point that many policies and programs sort of bump up against the forces of private land and housing markets. And what I'd like to talk about and show you a little bit of from Maryland is an indication of what I mean by just one example of some of these problems. And this is minimum lot size requirements. And I want to show you that often those requirements or density limits that are in place are often not binding. In other words, developers are not even building as densely as they already are allowed to do. So raising those limits or trying to encourage density in other ways often doesn't work. And I've seen a lot of evidence of this with TDR programs as well. Now, this is some evidence. I'm going to show you two bar graphs like this. This one is from Montgomery County, Maryland, and the next one will be from the more exurban counties in Maryland. Montgomery County, if you know the DC area, is the county, I have to get some water. I'll just stare at that bar graph for a minute. It's the county right next to DC. It has Bethesda that is a very urbanized core, but it also has an agricultural reserve in its western area. So it's got all kinds of different developments, some sprawl, some very urbanized areas. The metro goes out there. And what this graph shows you is for various zoning limits. So they have a lot of different zoning categories, density limit categories in the county, going from very, very dense on the left-hand side, all the way out to, actually they have some 25-acre minimum lot sizes in their ag reserve, but the one I've got it going out to 5-acre minimum lot sizes. So that's the horizontal graph. And then all that's on the vertical is the ratio of what's actually built to the limit. If it's binding, we should pretty much see, and this actually, a lot of work goes into putting these numbers together. But if these are binding, you should see those bars going up to about 1. The reason they can go above one in the 5 categories. They have a TDR program that allows some transfer in Montgomery County. But all of the other ones are down below 1. So for example, look at 0.25, those are quarter-acre lot limits. In those subdivisions where quarter-acre lots is the minimum lot size, developers are only building 80% of what they're allowed to build. So they're not even putting as many houses as they can in those subdivisions. Things get even more this way when you look at the more exurban counties. These are 2 counties that are commuting counties to DC, but they're much farther out. Calvert and Charles County are in southern Maryland. And pink is Calvert. Again, Calvert has a TDR program, so out at the high lot size limits, low density development, they're using TDRs to develop more densely. And that's why it goes above 1. But all the other bars are far below the limits, so they're not putting in as many houses as they could. What is the point of this? I mean, why am I talking about this? It means it's very difficult to get policies to encourage infill development or any kind of thing to transfer and get your density where you want it to be. So let me talk about the TDRs for a minute, because I've done some pretty detailed research on TDRs. TDRs allow development to be transferred from one property to another. You're sending properties put under an easement. This is for those of you who don't know about what TDRs are about. So your land is protected from development. They're used as a mechanism generally to protect land from development. Our receiving property can then be developed more intensively or more densely than otherwise, right? So the idea here is that perhaps we can use this tool to sort of, on the one hand, save farmland or forested lands or special habitat, land by waterways, all the land we'd like to be preserved. And we can take that density and just transfer it somewhere else. What people like about TDRs, in theory, local governments like it because they don't have to spend money, right? It's a purely private transaction. So they don't have to go buy the land and protect it from development or buy the development rights. They just set up the system, and then the market works to allow one owner to transfer their rights to another. But, and the other thing they like about it, actually, another couple other points. One is that it's often used in conjunction with downzoning land. So in Montgomery County, they took a big swath of their their western ag land, downzone it from 1 house per 5 acres to 1 in 25. That takes property value away from landowners, but what they said is, well, hang on, we did that to you, but now we're going to allow you to sell those development rights. So it's a way of compensation. So it's another thing that a lot of planners or local governments like about the programs. Also, it doesn't really restrict growth, it just shifts it around. And that can sometimes be popular. So, but nonetheless, it's a private market, right? They have to want to trade with each other. And those bar graphs that showed you those density limits not being met, well, somebody better want to have some demand. You got to want to buy these rights, right? So here's a big, messy picture from some of my own research. It's not California, even though it's shaped the same. This is Calvert County. That's the Chesapeake Bay. That's the Patuxent River. It's kind of a nice area. Calvert was having a lot of farmland converted to development. That whole part of Maryland really had it's probably why there was that 140% increase on that Maryland bar graph I showed you. It's one of the reasons. So around 1980, I think, they introduced a TDR program. And lucky for us as researchers, they actually have all of their data on their transactions. So we've analyzed this data pretty extensively. And what I'm showing you on the map, you don't need to look at every single thing, but for a moment, just focus on the red and the pink. Those are the subdivisions that were built between 1980 and 2001. If I extended the data, it'd look a little different. And what I'd like to point out, the red are the ones that were built using TDR. So they actually had a very active TDR market. They had a lot of land being protected from development. Those are the green areas. And they had a lot of TDRs used to develop more densely. So actually the most active market by far in the US. Most of these programs just don't work very well. But I want you to note where these TDR subdivisions are located. And they are located not in the town centers and the residential zoned areas, which are those orange and yellow. There. There's a little bit. The pink, but the pink is the non-TDR subdivision, so the red is where they're building more densely, the TDR ones. And they're really just being used in rural areas to develop those subdivisions a little more densely than they otherwise could. The point being, although you'd like this program, like TDR programs, to push your development towards your infrastructure areas and protect the farmland, in this market, which is a fairly unfettered TDR market, that's just not what's happening. Okay, they're going into the fairly low density areas. So note the TDR subdivisions, those are in red, are not located in those designated residential areas. But I want to point out, they've protected a lot of land from development in Calvert. Right? So they've paid a price? I don't know. You can be the judge. They've protected about 26,000 acres of land. They have a goal of 40,000. I think the size of the county is about 230,000 acres. So they have a lot of land that will never be developed, and that's the green areas. The price they paid is, well, they haven't, maybe they still have some sprawl. I've heard people criticize this program, I've heard people praise it. So here I'm just pointing out they've protected a lot of land, and most TDR programs, these are these programs that you're trying to use to sort of, change your land use patterns, they're mostly moribund. There's about 150 communities that have these programs on the books, but only a handful have had any real transactions. And again, when we've done case studies of several programs, and what really happens is that there's a lack of demand for additional density in the designated receiving areas. Most programs restrict the receiving areas to existing developed areas and town centers. And when they do that, they just cannot get the demand. There are other reasons why the programs fail, but that's the primary reason. And the Calvert program doesn't, because they don't do that. But you can be the judge whether you think that's a good way to go. So let me very briefly talk about Portlandia. Okay, somebody in here has seen the show. Okay. And I know we have some Oregon students, or we did yesterday, so I will be careful because I'm not an expert on Portland. But Portland is the poster child, right, for smart growth. Though my understanding is, their land use policies predate the smart growth movement, so I'm not sure they actually use that term a lot. Their central policy that guides development in Portland is their urban growth boundary. They also are somewhat unique in having an elected regional government in charge of land use. So they get away a little bit from this fragmented decision-making problem. And because it's the poster child, well, let's ask the question, what do people say? Well, there's been a lot of study of Portland, not me, but others and colleagues I work with. Is it working? I would say most researchers that I know would say a qualified yes, in that there's a higher density of development, smaller average lot sizes, increased connectivity within neighborhoods. It's more pedestrian friendly as a result of their policies, and they've protected land outside their urban growth boundary. And if you're familiar with, I think some of the work Yang Song and Garrett Knapp have done a lot of work in Portland, and some of these conclusions are from their work. Nonetheless, we have to recognize there have been some ancillary impacts. Land and housing prices, I think most people would agree, are higher. And of course, there's been a series of challenges to the program in Oregon. Lawsuits, a host of ballot measures. Ballot measure 37 that passed, I believe, was that the one in 2004? I think there were a series in the late 90s and then the early 2000s. They had a state task force, they had a new ballot measure, they had changes, many changes in their local land use designations and their policy in Portland. There's continuing controversy. So I think part of the price they pay they take a more rigid approach, I would argue, and part of the price they pay is they're fighting these battles with the property rights folks, with various other interest groups. Maryland would consider itself the other smart growth poster child. In 1997, they passed an actual set of laws, 6 six pieces, I think, that have used the term smart growth. And Maryland Governor Paris Glendening, I think, sort of made his name by using that terminology. The focus in Maryland is different than what they do in Oregon, and that's the use of priority funding areas. PFAs are areas that are designated for state infrastructure spending. So all incorporated areas in the state, and then designated growth areas that are served by sewer or planned for sewer and water. And then if it's beyond existing developments in areas like Calvert County and Charles County, like I showed you, they have to have densities that are above 3.5 houses per acre. So every county had to designate PFAs. And then the state would target their spending to those areas. So it was a carrot approach, not a stick. And most of that money is state transportation money. Is it working? I'm sorry to report. Most of the evidence suggests it's not really doing a lot. Yeah, okay, it's doing some little bit, and it certainly has changed the dialogue in Maryland, I think, in a good way, but the program has been estimated to be pretty ineffectual. Land use patterns have not been substantially altered. The primary problem is that the affected state funding is just not a big enough carrot to offset those countervailing market forces. Again, I'd say the reality of the land and housing markets, and the problem they have is they're not even clear what funding is really affected. So in the transportation agency, they're not in the habit of looking at their spending in a spatial way, so this has been a big shift for them, and it's not clear which of their funding they're supposed to guide to those priority funding areas. But in general, I think the carrot's not big enough. It's not a big enough amount of money to affect those land use patterns. So in summary, I would say some lessons learned are that markets matter a lot, and if policy is designed without a good understanding of the local land and housing markets, it may be ineffective in changing land use patterns. That's if it's a carrot approach like TDRs or the PFA approach, or it could have some ancillary impacts. It's a stick, and it could actually, not all sprawl is bad, reduce overall welfare. I'm not here to make policy prescriptions, but I will say what I feel are a few guidelines. I think it's important for local communities to figure out the real problem they're trying to solve. Set clear objectives. I mean, one example, I'm not saying this is an appropriate example even, but Calvert had their clear objective. We are trying to preserve 40,000 acres of farmland. And then design your policy to achieve that objective. And I would argue, don't be afraid of policies that rely on price signals and market mechanisms. I think it can be a way to make TDRs work if we try harder. And road pricing, please. Thank you.